When I first bought my land 15 years ago, it wasn't because of the house I could have lived anywhere, but because of the creek. It wasn't just a trickle of water. It was a living, breathing vein that ran through the property, feeding the trees, the soil, and every living thing around it. The neighborhood that later sprouted up the million-dollar mansions, the shiny SUVs, the manicured lawns was built because of that creek. The developers loved the idea of waterfront luxury, so they sold the dream. Houses with backyards dipping right into nature's arms. Little did they know, that creek wasn't just decoration, it was the lifeline. I always kept it clear, flowing, and natural. But then the HOA came into the picture, like a self-appointed god, deciding what's beautiful and what's a nuisance. At first, it was little things, letters in the mail, about property compliance and community harmony. Then one day I woke up to find a wall of fresh concrete poured across the creek like a dam, blocking its flow. The sight punched the air out of my lungs. They didn't ask, didn't warn, they just did it. And as I stood there, staring at the gray slab cutting through what used to be crystal water, I knew this wasn't just a violation. This was war. Asterisk, the HOA president, a smug man named Gregory, with a voice that sounded like it was permanently stuck in condescending mode, called me 2 days after the concrete appeared. We had to do it for safety, he said, his words dripping with fake concern. The creek was eroding land near the homes. We couldn't risk property values. Property value estimates. What it always came down to with these people, not nature, not balance, not respect for the land, just numbers on a piece of paper. I told him the creek wasn't a threat. It was designed by nature to handle runoff and prevent flooding. But Gregory didn't care. We're improving the community, he insisted. When I mentioned they had no legal right to touch my land, he chuckled a slow, deliberate laugh that made my jaw tighten. The HOA always does what's best for the majority, he said, as if that somehow gave them power over me. That was the moment I decided. They think they control me, but they have no idea what kind of hell they've unleashed. Asterisk, it didn't take long for the consequences to start. The first sign came during a heavy rainstorm about 2 weeks later. Normally, the creek would have carried the water downstream, filtering it naturally through the bends and rocks. But now, it was like the earth had been suffocated. The water had nowhere to go. It pooled in the low spots behind the concrete barrier they created, turning their meticulously landscaped backyards into shallow ponds. At first, the homeowners thought it was a temporary nuisance, just a little water. But when it didn't drain after 2 days of clear skies, the whispers began. Why is the water still here? Why does it smell like that? They called Gregory, who confidently told them it would settle and that the HOA had it under control. He even sent out an email assuring everyone the situation was fully managed. But from my porch, I watched their million-dollar homes start sinking inch by inch, their manicured lawns collapsing like deflated balloons. The ground was turning into quicksand, and I couldn't help but think, they sealed their own fate, one truckload of concrete at a time. By the end of the 3rd week, the neighborhood was no longer the picture-perfect postcard they had bragged about in glossy HOA newsletters. The lush green yards that once looked like golf course fairways were now slick with standing water. And the smell was like something out of a horror movie. Stagnant water, mixed with fertilizer and lawn chemicals, brewed a rancid soup that carried on the breeze. It started attracting mosquitoes the size of grapes, buzzing like a plague in every corner of their designer patios. Outdoor kitchens and fire pits became useless because no one could stand to sit outside without being eaten alive. Their luxury homes, with their granite countertops and floor-to-ceiling windows, were sinking by the day, foundations shifting, cracks spiderwebbing across basement walls. Some of them tried pumping the water out, but it was pointless because the source of the disaster wasn't above ground, it was the creek they'd killed. Without its natural channel, the water was reclaiming everything, and it was ruthless. I would sip my morning coffee on my porch, watching them panic in their designer rain boots, shouting over sump pumps that never stopped humming. They had turned paradise into a swamp, and the irony was sweeter than honey. Asterisk, it happened on a Tuesday morning, just after a week of non-stop thunderstorms. I was out by my fence line, checking the water levels, when I heard a deep, hollow cracking sound, followed by a noise that made my stomach drop, the groan of a house giving up. One of the luxury homes at the far end of the cul-de-sac, a 4,000 square foot custom masterpiece that the HOA president had personally bragged about during construction, began to sink. Not slowly, either it tilted hard to the left, porch, columns snapping like twigs, windows shattering under pressure. The ground underneath it looked like wet clay, bubbling up as water gushed from every seam. By the time the homeowners scrambled out with their designer dogs tucked under their arms, the garage had already collapsed, swallowing to luxury SUVs whole. The screams echoed across the swamp they had created. That's when panic set in. The HOA board called an emergency meeting under a flimsy event, 10-tone of those cheap pop-up canopies they used for wine tastings when things were still idyllic. Only now, there was no wine, no smiles, just mud-streaked faces and a stench of fear. Some blamed the construction company, others blamed the rain. But no one dared admit the truth that their arrogance and illegal concrete dumping had turned this land into a death trap. Watching from my porch, I almost felt bad for them. Almost. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood looked like a war zone. 3 more homes had started leaning at dangerous angles. Their pristine white fences now half submerged in brown foul-smelling water. The once perfectly manicured lawns were underwater, littered with floating patio furniture, children's toys, and broken pieces of decking. The HOA scrambled to control the narrative, hiring lawyers and engineers to blame anything but themselves. They tried pointing fingers at unusual weather patterns and even attempted to claim the creek had been unstable for decades, which was laughable considering I had lived there for 30 years without a single flood. Their arrogance caught up with them when the first lawsuit hit, filed by none other than the family whose house had started sinking first. The complaint was brutal, loaded with pictures, videos, and expert testimony stating the obvious. By pouring concrete into a natural waterway without permits, the HOA violated multiple environmental regulations and directly caused the flooding. And the lawsuits didn't stop there. Within a week, nearly every homeowner had hired an attorney. And the HOA board's little kingdom began to crack, just like their foundations. The president, who once strutted around like a suburban king, now looked like a man walking to his own execution. Meanwhile, the water kept rising. Pumps failed, sandbags split, and the smell of rot was everywhere. Watching from my dry porch, coffee in hand, I couldn't help but think karma sure knows how to swing a sledgehammer. 2 weeks later, the HOA that once ruled like tyrants no longer existed. Their so-called luxury community was now a disaster zone. Half the homes were condemned, the other half were empty shells with water lines creeping halfway up their walls. Insurance companies refused payouts after discovering the HOA had violated multiple state and federal laws by tampering with a protected waterway. The board members tried to resign quietly, but lawsuits followed them like bloodhounds. Bankruptcy hearings began, and word spread fast. Local news stations, environmental watchdogs, and even state officials got involved. The HOA president, the same smug guy who once told me to get with the times, was served with criminal charges for illegal land alteration and property destruction. As for me, my creek flowed freely again, thanks to state intervention and a restoration project fully funded by fines collected from the HOA. The same homes that were supposed to be worth a fortune were now worthless, sitting in what was legally declared a swamp. One by one, those homeowners drove away in moving vans, their dreams drowned by greed and arrogance. I stood on my porch the day the last one left, watching the sun glint off the water they tried to bury, and I laughed. They came after my land, my creek, my peace, and in the end, nature and karma both got their revenge.